And we have a very special treat today. We have a scholar among us, Rebekah, if you would come on up here. And I'll try to articulate a few things here about you. Rebekah, who's been a part of our Ruach family for some months, right, since you've joined us in Boston here, and a historian of ancient Judaism and early Christianity, Fulbright Fellow affiliated with Hebrew University after Princeton, right? And she's currently working on her PhD in religion of Mediterranean antiquity at Princeton, and a fellow at Harvard for Jewish studies. And her PhD work now is focused on Second Temple Judaism and specifically on the book of Revelation. Is that right? Can you all say wow? Wow. So we are privileged to have you share with us today a little bit about Revelation and some other things that might connect with Hanukkah. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got for us today.
So there are several stories about the meaning of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a time to celebrate the miracle of the menorah remaining lit in the temple for 8 days. It's also a holiday that memorializes a very familiar theme. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. But there is a third theme that often gets subsumed in the story of the Maccabean revolt and the restoration of the temple. It's the story of those Judeans who were not soldiers, the women, the children, the elderly, who were persecuted for their Torah-observance and who died for their faith. Today, we're going to talk about some ancient stories of martyrdom and what their model for self-sacrifice can mean for us as followers of Yeshua. The evils of religiously motivated violence, like suicide bombings and murder in the name of God, have been on our minds and on our screens for a couple decades now. Today, we're not talking about that. As Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory put it, no soul was ever saved by hate, no truth ever proved by violence, no redemption was ever wrought by holy war. But redemption has been brought by dying for God and dying for one's people. Martyrdom in ancient Jewish and early Christian models did not mean killing oneself and killing others in the name of God, but being faithful to one's beliefs, even if it means sacrificing everything. There are two historical accounts of the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. You might notice that these books tell two different versions of what happened. In First Maccabees, the heroes of the Hanukkah story are Judah Maccabee and his father and brothers. In this telling, it is their pious zeal, tenacity, and insight that allows this Hasmonean family to recover Jerusalem, restore a defiled temple, and eventually conquer the surrounding regions. Once the Hasmonean family sets themselves up as kings, their dynasty was troubled by questions of lineage. They were priests, not descendants of David. So as scholar Daniel Schwartz points out, First Maccabees is essentially a dynastic history written to promote the Hasmonean right to rule Judea. It's little wonder, then, that the heroes of the Hanukkah story in First Maccabees are these kings, these would-be kings. But Second Maccabees is not a book about priests who would be king. It's a book about Judaism. The writer of Second Maccabees uses the term Hellenismos, or the Greek way of life, to talk about not just idolatry, but a system of values incompatible with the Jewish way of life, a Judaismos. This is why some scholars have made the case that Second Maccabees is the first time we see adherence to Torah practices, like circumcision, Shabbat, and Kashrut, presented as something like our modern notion of religion. Second Maccabees also tells a different version of the Hanukkah story, one in which the Hasmonean family only makes a rather brief appearance. They are not the true heroes of the story. Second Maccabees begins by recounting how the sins of the religious leadership in Jerusalem provoked God to turn his face away from Israel. Everything was going rather well under the pious leadership of Onias, the high priest, until Jason stole his high priesthood and began to encourage his fellow countrymen to value a Greek way of life over a Jewish one. The priests neglected their obligations in the temple, excited about a new gymnasium and its activities. They disdained the honors prized by their fathers and put the highest value upon Greek forms of prestige. So it's important to point out that Judeans had been living under Greek rule since Alexander the Great, for well over 150 years. Second Maccabees, in fact, is written in Greek, not Hebrew, like First Maccabees. It was not the Greek way of life that was the problem, at least at first, but being a good Greek citizen had taken precedence over being a good Jew. So, God turns his face away, and suddenly, as our writer puts it, those ways of living that they admired and wished to imitate completely became their enemies. So things go downhill. Antiochus sends an ambassador to Jerusalem to compel the Jewish people to fully forsake their ancestral traditions and take up Greek ones. As many historians point out, Antiochus was probably not thinking of his policies as religious persecution, more like sound statecraft. He wanted his newly minted Judean citizens to start acting like citizens of a Hellenistic empire. For the Seleucids, making the Judeans good Greek citizens meant rededicating their temple to Zeus, forcing the citizens to participate in things like celebrating the king's birthday with some sacrifices on the side. But for many faithful Judeans, if the Greek way of life meant forsaking the Torah, they were unwilling. The turning point in Second Maccabees and its story of Jewish suffering is not a moment of revolution, like the famous story in First Maccabees, where Matthias, the father of Judah Maccabee, kills an apostate and demands that those who are loyal to the Torah join the ranks of the Maccabean revolutionaries. The turning point in Second Maccabees comes not with warriors, nor powerful priests, nor future kings, but with the actions of a 90-year-old scribe named Eleazar and an anonymous mother and her 7 sons. The Judeans were being forced to demonstrate their allegiance to the Greek way of life by breaking the laws of kashrut and by committing idolatry. We're told that Eleazar, a man of advanced age and wisdom, was known for his excellence of life, even from his childhood. Because of their previous acquaintance with him, his persecutors suggested that Eleazar pretend to eat the meat and so save himself from death. But he refused to leave a poor example for others, the impression that he had gone over to an alien tradition. So he is tortured, and just before he dies, he declares, "I am enduring terrible sufferings in my body under this beating, but in my soul I am glad to suffer these things because I fear him." Next, Second Maccabees tells the story of an anonymous mother, who medieval sources would later call Hannah, and her 7 sons. This family is also arrested in order to force them to sacrifice their faith. One after the other, each of the brothers refuse to eat, are tortured and killed. Hannah not only watches each of her children die, but encourages them to remain loyal to the Torah, as she says, "The creator of the world, who shaped the beginning of man and devised the origin of all things, will in his mercy give life and breath back to you again, since you now forget yourselves for the sake of his laws." The message of 2 Maccabees 7 is one of hope. Hannah does not think she is truly bereft, for she is sure that death is not the end. Her sons will be raised up again in the end of days, and the wicked will receive their reward. Hannah and her children also take comfort in another idea, that dying for the sake of the Torah comes not only with eternal reward, but can save Israel. Before he dies, the youngest son promises that God will show mercy and bring an end to the punishment of Israel's sins because he and his brothers were willing to die for their faith. It is only after Eleazar and this righteous family give up their lives for the Torah that the author of 2 Maccabees finally turns to our absent hero, Judah Maccabee. It is only after the deaths of the martyrs that Judah is able to reclaim Jerusalem and restore the temple. For 2nd Maccabees, then, the true heroes of the Hanukkah story are the martyrs, whose deaths, in essence, atone for the sins of an entire nation. It's a story that finds its echo in the story of Yeshua more than a century later. The heroes of the Hanukkah story, the true champions of Judaism, are everyday people, scribes, mothers, and children. Their actions reconcile God to his people. More than a century after 2nd Maccabees was written, Jewish communities faced another empire and another set of cultural and religious values that sat uneasily with their own. In 70 CE, the temple was not just desecrated as it was by Antiochus IV, but destroyed by the Roman army. Reflecting on this loss, a follower of Yeshua named John penned the book of Revelation to encourage believers living in the Jewish diasporic communities of Asia Minor. John and his audience, like Hannah centuries before, were caught between a Jewish way of life and a Greek way of life. In order to be wealthy, comfortable members of Greco-Roman cities like Ephesus or Pergamum, Gentile and possibly Jewish followers of Yeshua would have been pressured to do as the Romans did. If you wanted to develop your contacts for business, that would mean participating in civic society, doing things like joining the local guild and attending banquets where you might eat choice cuts of meat from animals that had recently been sacrificed to Zeus. For John's audience, not eating food sacrificed to idols wouldn't necessarily mean persecution, as it did in 2nd Maccabees, but it would mean cutting yourself off from the halls of power, from social capital, from the movers and shakers. But like the martyrs in 2nd Maccabees, John's audience also faced choices of self-sacrifice that might indeed lead to death. By the 1st century CE, being a good citizen of the Roman Empire meant participating in an emerging facet of society, the new state religion or imperial cult, with its prayers to the emperor and sacrifices for him. In return, the emperor was expected to act on behalf of his people as their savior and benefactor. In his address to the community in Pergamum, John says, "I know your works and where you dwell and where Satan's throne is." Most scholars suspect that John is referring to the Temple of Augustus and its cult of the emperor. Pergamum was the first city in Asia Minor in which the Romans established the imperial cult, and by the end of the 1st century CE, all 7 cities that John writes to in the book of Revelation had temples or altars dedicated to the imperial cult. There would have been a lot of social pressure, not just for Gentile believers in Yeshua, but also Jewish citizens, to prove their civic loyalties, perhaps through participation in a cult that was unavoidably linked to the well-being of the city and the empire. There is a famous letter written by a governor in Asia Minor, written around the same time as the book of Revelation. Pliny the Younger tells the emperor about a strange group of people accused of worshiping a man named Christ as God. When on trial, Pliny had these people disprove this accusation by offering prayer and sacrifice to the emperor's image. The author of the book of Revelation speaks of those within his audience, like one named Antipas, who had lost their lives for the sake of their faithfulness to the commandments and their testimony about Yeshua. He warns his listeners that they too may be required to lay down their lives. For John, to eat food sacrificed to idols or to worship the emperor was to open oneself up to the forces of death and to Satan himself. And it was to deny their faith, their testimony about Yeshua. John's 1st century readers were faced with a similar choice as their brothers and sisters 200 years before. Their choice was not just between living a Jewish way of life or a Roman one, but between loyalty to God and to Yeshua, or loyalty to a king claiming to be God. Much like in 2nd Maccabees, the heroes of the book of Revelation are not powerful warriors, but regular, everyday people who were willing to die for their faith. In Revelation 12, John reveals a cosmic vision of a war in the heavens between the archangel Michael and the ancient serpent, Satan. We are told that the great dragon has been cast down from the heavens and now makes war against Israel and her children, those who keep the commandments of God and those who bear witness to Yeshua. John makes it clear that the ultimate defeat of the dragon, at least in part, comes at the hands of those who conquer the dragon by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. In Revelation's theology of martyrdom, those who die for the sake of God and for the sake of their testimony about Yeshua are the real victors, both over the Roman Empire and over the ancient serpent. And in John's vision of the final days, the martyred will sit with the Messiah in judgment and rule with him in the temple city of New Jerusalem. In both the books of Revelation and 2 Maccabees, those who die for the sake of their Judaism are not just rewarded with life after death, but they also play a crucial role in the redemption and restoration of Israel. According to the Talmud, one is not permitted to seek out martyrdom. This is because of the value placed on human life. One should live by the commandments of the Torah, according to Leviticus 18:5, which for the rabbis means that one should not die for them. However, there are some exceptions. One is justified giving up one's life for the sake of the Torah to avoid committing idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. And, as Maimonides argues, situations of persecution are also an exception, where even the smallest violation of the Torah is meant to demonstrate disloyalty to Judaism. And it is precisely such an exceptional circumstance of persecution that faced Eleazar, Hannah, and some of the first-century followers of Yeshua. Yet their choice to die for God seems so exceptional, their example of piety so far afield from the sorts of choices and concerns that we have today. What does martyrdom mean in a 21st century world that is so very different and yet not so different? What does it mean in our lives to witness to the power and love and mercy of God in a way that shines a light, that points to the character of a God who is mercy instead of one who must inflict violence, to a God who asks us to live for him? The book of Revelation offers some clues as to what living as a martyr might look like today. The author uses the Greek word martus and its cognates to speak of literal martyrs, people who lay down their lives for their faith. But he also uses this concept in the legal sense of witness, someone who testifies. In the Gospel of John, chapter 5, Yeshua speaks of John the Baptist as just such a legal witness. As Yeshua points out, if I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. Yeshua is alluding to a principle in the Torah. You need more than one witness to prove the truth of a thing. And John the Baptist wasn't a witness through his death, but through his life and his ministry. Yeshua describes John as a burning and shining lamp, which is, of course, an apt metaphor for the Hanukkah season. Yeshua himself is a witness, as he says in the Gospel of John, I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. We, too, are called to be witnesses to the gospel, to God's redemptive love for his people. The book of Hebrews tells us that there is a great cloud of witnesses in the heavens, whom the followers of Yeshua should imitate. Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Yeshua, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarded its shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The idea of endurance, patient endurance, or hupomone in the Greek, appears over and over again in the book of Revelation. John, the author of Revelation, reveals that he was exiled for the sake of the testimony of Yeshua. He pens his apocalypse from the desolate, craggy shores of the island of Patmos, isolated from his fellow believers. John says that he too is a partner in the kingdom of God, a partner in the patient endurance, hupomone, that are in Yeshua. John is an example of what being a witness can look like. Not dying for God, but a willingness to live with discomfort and suffering for the sake of the kingdom. A willingness to sacrifice self. As the book of Hebrews frames it, living the life of a witness means running a race. It means discomfort and disappointment, suffering and endurance. As Revelation 12:11 defines how the righteous conquer the serpent, it means we hold fast to the testimony about Yeshua so much that we love not our lives, even to death. To be a martyr is not about dying for God, but about living in such a way that when death comes, your life has been fully lived for God. Death is not the goal, but when death comes, you have given all. In the words of David, everything comes from you, and we have simply given back to you what is yours. Being a martyr does not mean dying rather than eating Antiochus's pork or not sacrificing to the emperor. Being a martyr means missing the banquet and its networking opportunities. It means proclaiming the way in the desert and maybe upsetting some people. It means choosing a Jewish way of life when a Greek way of life looks more exciting or would just be easier. It means sacrifice of self. If we have the courage to live as martyrs, to let our lives be a burning, shining sacrifice of self, that is just as powerful a witness as dying for something. In some ways, it's much harder. As the Amora Haigh bar Abba says, if a man said to me, give your life for the sanctification of the name of the Holy One, blessed be he, I would give it if they killed me immediately. But I am not able to endure that which the generation of the persecuted endured. So it's one thing in the rush of the moment to muster your courage and to sacrifice your life once and for all for God. But it's a much more difficult thing to sacrifice your life day after day. So what would it look like in our lives to live as martyrs, to let our lives be testimony to Yeshua as we go to school, to work, about our daily life? In the Hanukkah story, we have models of people, regular, ordinary people, who, because they gave their lives to God, were willing to give also their deaths. And as followers of Yeshua, the way to be a martyrs is to live our lives as Yeshua did, to patiently endure, to run the race, to disregard shame, to be a burning light that shines on a loving God. Our job isn't to save the world, it's to be a witness to the one who does. This isn't a passive thing, nor is it a one-time thing. We are called not just to observe the world from afar, but be active witnesses. And this sort of martyrdom is also a sacrifice that points to Yeshua's. When ordinary people are willing to live their lives as a witness for God, it can change the world. For the Maccabees, martyrdom defeats armies and turns God back to his people. And for believers, being a martyr, testifying to our faith through daily sacrifice of self, points others to Yeshua's ultimate sacrifice for the world and his promise of life after death and a kingdom beyond compare. To be a martyr is not really about dying for God, but living for him. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Rebekah. That was ennobling and convicting and good, and lots to think about. And I love that big picture, living for God, so that even in our death, our lives are of value to Him, and that we, in my own words, will say, we'll hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." So, thank you very much for sharing with us. And let us.